Hi everyone and welcome back to Advanced Higher Biology. Today we're continuing on with Unit 2, Organisms and Evolution, and we are on the fourth and second last key area, sex and behaviour. So just like the rest of these videos, I'm going to go through this all in one go. As I've said before, this can be quite lengthy, there is quite a lot of information, so you might want to split it up into these sub-key areas, but I'll explain that as I go along. So to start off with sex and behaviour, we'll look at part A, which is parental investment. Now, it's something you'll have discussed a little bit in higher, particularly when you're talking about primates and primate behaviour. So the idea of parental investment is the investment of energy, time, resources that parents put into their offspring. The idea is that parental investment itself is costly, but it does increase the probability of both production and survival of young. So essentially, the more investment you put in being a parent, the more likely that you're going to have offspring, and more likely these offspring are going to survive and move on, pass on your genes. Now, in terms of parental investment, we kind of are going to look at differences between males and females. And essentially, a lot of this boils down to the female side having a lot more investment in it. Even if you think about the idea of pregnancy, of gestation itself, the females undergoing changes to the uterus, developing the baby, the offspring, eggs, anything like that at all. There's a lot that goes on. So first thing to go back to is both sperm and eggs and comparing both of them. Now, this is something you'll have discussed even in National 5 level. The idea is that sperm are very energy cheap. There are millions and millions of them produced. It takes very little energy to do so. Lots of these sperm are then produced over the entirety of the male's lifespan. There's not really a cut-off date where sperm either stops being produced or it's not viable anymore. However, on the other side, eggs are a lot more energy expensive. They're much more limited, so typically there's only, say, in humans, one a month being produced. There's a limited number of them. They're produced during a limited period because there comes a point where essentially a female's eggs will run out. It takes a lot more energy to produce them, develop them, this side of things. So there are big differences in terms of the overall investment. In terms of fertilisation itself, when the sperm and egg nuclei are going to fuse together, there is also two different forms of this that you may have came across before. Typically, we talk about internal fertilisation. So this is just where the sperm and egg nuclei fuse together inside the female. But there's also external as well. So external fertilisation, as the name suggests, is when the nucleus of the sperm and nucleus of the egg fuse together outside the female. Now, typically this is something you would look at in, say for example, fish, where fish will drop off eggs at a certain area, sperm will come across and will release, fish will come across and release their sperm over those eggs, hoping that the sperm and egg nuclei fuse together. And there's issues and pros and cons with both of these. Now, in terms of these pros and cons, the benefit of external fertilisation is you can produce huge amount of offspring. If you release a huge amount of eggs and then another fish comes across and fertilises them with a huge amount of sperm, then that's a lot of offspring. Now, typically, as you'll have noticed, this key area is kind of talking about the trade-off of this. So often if you have this huge amount of, say, baby fish that have been produced, there's very, very little, if any, parental investment. There's loads of them because not many of them are actually going to survive. The cost of this is many of these gametes, as I've said, are going to either be predated, so something comes across and eats the eggs, or they're not going to be fertilised in the first place. Maybe there's no fish, maybe it doesn't work. It's a big gamble. As I said, there is, if any, limited parental care, and that means there's also going to be a really low offspring survival rate. So again, you can go and produce loads and loads, hundreds, thousands of offspring, but maybe only a handful of them actually survive. So that is the cost of this situation. With internal fertilisation, no, there's a bit of a flip. There's going to be a much better chance of successful fertilisation taking place. There's going to be a higher offspring survival rate comparative to external because the offspring is going to be almost protected. It's retained internally, it's going to have more protection, more development. You don't need to use lots of eggs for this to actually take place. And there's a lot of investment that goes on, but ultimately meaning there should be a higher offspring survival rate. As I said though, this does require energy, so for the costs, first of all, a mate has to be located. You're not just dropping off an egg and hoping it gets fertilised. There has to be reproduction taking place, so a mate must be located. That requires energy in itself. And there's also going to have to be reproduction taking place, fertilization taking place, where there is direct transfer of gametes. So there's got to be sperm nucleus fusing with the egg nucleus, for example. Now, again, another little comparison that we will look into is this idea of R and K species. So R and K selection theory is basically a classification of organisms either being an R strategist or a K strategist. And this is all dependent on the level of parental investment that takes place, and therefore the number of offspring that are produced. Now, there's quite a lot of information, so I thought I'd make it into a table just to try and make it a little bit more easy to access. It looks a bit complicated, but it's actually very, very simple. The main thing is just trying to remember which one is R and which one is K. And yes, you have lowercase r and capital K. So in terms of R selection, the idea of this is almost like going back to the idea of different types of weed in higher biology. You're looking at the quick and many strategy. So in terms, it's almost like the sperm of the animal kingdom here. You're going to have smaller organisms that are going to reach maturity very, very quickly. They're going to reproduce as quickly as possible. They're hopefully going to go and produce as many offspring as possible. And then there's very little parental care that takes place. So most offspring are not going to make it, they're going to die, but some will. So the idea of R selection is it's small, it's less energy intensive, it's lots of gametes, lots of offspring, hopefully some survive, hope for the best, die early. For K selection, no, that's like the more careful, energy invested approach. So you'll have slower and fewer species. You'll have larger animals, say for example, they will have a longer lifespan, they'll reach sexual maturity at a slower stage. Because of the longer lifespan, they will reproduce many times. They're not going to have as much offspring as an R-selected species. They will have fewer offspring, but there will be a high level of parental care, trying to make sure that fewer number of offspring actually survive to adulthood, where they will also then go through reproduction and living longer in this side of things. So again, it's important you know which are R selections and which are K selections. If you were given some information in a test, you should be able to figure out quite quickly which form of classification this is taking place. So again, just try and get those ideas in your head, the quick and many approach and the slower and fewer approach. Now, R selection itself, the sort of the quick version, this tends to take place in unstable environments. And that means that if a species has not reached its reproductive capacity, there's essentially a lot of niches to exploit, whereas K selection would take place in a stable environment. So we see this sometimes in, for example, plants. The idea of a R strategist would take over an area that's able to be colonized. So say, for example, there has been a wildfire in a forest. What's going to happen is R strategists, like quick growing weeds, will quickly take place. Their seeds will grow in this new area. They'll release loads of seeds. Those seeds will grow really quickly. They'll reach sexual maturity and spread seeds very quickly as well, and quickly try and get a foothold, and their population will increase massively. It takes a lot longer for just an oak tree to grow in that area. So R will take over an area, grow very, very quickly because it's unstable, it's new. Whereas if there's just a constantly stable ecosystem taking place, then a K selection would tend to actually do better. Now on to the next sub-key area. We're looking at reproductive behaviours and different mating systems in animals. Now again, a lot of this isn't particularly complicated. There's just a lot of words for you to remember in the right order. So for example here, if we look at mating systems, this is based on how many mates an individual has during a breeding season. So during a time where they're actually going to mate and breed with other organisms. Now, we have two main forms, which we will go into a little bit more detail. As always, it's what we do in biology all the time. We have monogamy and we have polygamy. Names you may have came across before, it's not just a biological thing, but in terms of monogamy, you would have a pair of animals that mate to the exclusion of all the others. What that means is they're not reproducing with anyone else. You have a pair that mate exclusively together, and it doesn't matter what's going on for the rest of them. We've got this nice bird happy family here on the left. On the other side though, you have polygamy, where individuals of one sex will have more than one mate. So they are not exclusive, they are mating with lots of other individuals as well. Okay, so monogamy, one, polygamy, many, that's relatively straightforward. Within polygamy, no, you have two different types that sound very similar and get really annoying. So you have polygyny, where the male mates exclusively with a group of females. So this is what you see quite a lot in the animal kingdom. You'll have the male, and the male will have a group of females, and that male will go and mate with all the members of those females. So that is a polygamous situation, and in this case, polygyny, because it's male. In polyandry, though, you have the inverse. And for example, you might remember this from bees in higher biology. If you have polyandry taking place, again, polygamous, but in this case, it's the female that mates with a number of males. So the one female will mate with a number of males, and again, this all takes place in the same breeding season. In terms of courtship behaviour, though, this is something that can be really interesting with different animals. There will be lots of different animals that have mate selection courtship rituals, which is basically how do they attract a mate. I'm sure you'll have seen plenty of different videos before in biology or somatabras with all these weird and wonderful displays from different birds or dancing spiders and all this sort of stuff. Basically, any form of ritual that is trying to convince a mate to reproduce with you is courtship behaviour. Now, these take place in loads of different animals. We really focus a lot on birds and fish. So in this case here on the right hand side, there's a red pain lid, in a tank. The red there is to show in male sticklebacks, they have this sort of like red neck, this throat that appears in breeding season. So females will be attracted to the red pen, males will try and fight the red pen because they're not understanding it's not a fish, they're not that smart. In birds and fish though, there can be species-specific sign stimuli, which is really quite difficult to say, but that's for example like the red pen. It's something that a member of that species shows, and it's also showing breeding, the breeding seasons here, the time for breeding is here, that sort of thing, and there'll be these fixed action pattern responses, which is a very fancy word for saying instinctive reactions. So this is where you're either going to be attracted to this colour or this display, or you're maybe going to attack it if it's a rival male. It's just an instinctive reaction in a form of courtship behaviour. Now, one of the ones we have discussed before is sexual selection. So sexual selection selects for characteristics. These have little survival benefit, sometimes quite the opposite, usually the opposite, but they increase your chances of mating. So we discussed before in terms of sexual dimorphism, where you would have, for example, this male bird of paradise. Being able to puff out your feathers and have this luminous turquoise strip is not going to help you survive. If anything, it makes you more of a target, which is why Darwin thought, why do animals put energy into this sort of thing? But because it's sexual selection, it increases your chances of mating. You're showing off your plumage, you're showing your fitness, the energy you've put into this, and hopefully attract a female in this case. When we talk about sexual dimorphism, we're usually talking about males having these different colours to try and attract females. However, important to know, reversed sexual dimorphism also exists. In this case, you might have a larger female or a more colourful female. Usually when we talk about it though, think about going back to the peacock. You'll have a male peacock that's very colourful and has this amazing selection of tail feathers, but the female itself will just kind of be sort of white and grey colour and not have the same investment into tails. So like we said before, pheasants are also a good example of this. On the left, female pheasant, very normal looking, much more camouflaged, less likely to just get killed, but the male has all these incredible colours and making all these noises. Again, differences between them, so it's sexual dimorphism, and in terms of sexual selection, the male pheasant would hope those colours and feathers will attract the female and be more likely to mate. As I mentioned, this can also occur between males. So in terms of sexual selection, males are trying to attract females. However, through this, there can also be conflict. And in this conflict, you'll have male-to-male rivalry. So essentially, fighting each other for females. Now, you'll notice in bracket this also says real or ritualized. The difference between this is sometimes animals are fighting to the death over females. Other times, though, there's almost a sort of competition is set up. You'll often have a sort of alpha male of this group, and there might be a new animal who's decided, oh, I want to come in and have a try, I want to be the alpha. In this case, they'll do some form of ritualized response, whether it's antlers with stags like the bottom right. There will be a winner, and before there's actually a genuine fight to the death, there'll be a sort of winner of this competition, and the loser sort of backs out and is like, right, fair enough, I tried. That would be a ritualized one. Real is a genuine fight. Now again, in these male-to-male rivalry, in these conflicts, there's going to be increased access to females. Males are fighting for dominance, and usually or often this will involve various weapons. So, for example, antlers, horns. Some insects have like large antennae that are comparing. Things like this, there'll be some sort of device going on. Now, we've mentioned before, this leads or can lead to something called female choice. So, in sexual selection, if a male going through sexual dimorphism is doing some form of courtship behaviour and some sort of display, they're essentially hoping one of the females chooses them. So in the female choice, as the name suggests, the female chooses who they are going to mate with. They're going to decide who is showing the fittest genes, who's got the nicest colours, who's doing whatever's happening. The female has the choice here. And what they're assessing is what we call the honest signals of fitness. So basically, your honest signals, as we've mentioned, they indicate how favourable your alleles are, what your fitness is like. When we talk about low parasite burden, basically looking for how healthy you are. If you're a big, bright, colourful bird doing this incredible dance, you're more likely to be healthy. You're not ill, weak, full of parasites. You have high fitness. You'll have favourable alleles that you want to pass on to your offspring. That is the honest signal that these females are choosing. Now, one of the parts we'll look at finally as well is something called lekking. Might be a word you've came across before, might not be. It does come up quite a lot though. This is specific to birds. So bird species sometimes have a lick or go through lekking behaviour. So what this is it's an area known as a lick where there's almost this ritualised courtship behaviour and female choice takes place. It's like some sort of bizarre bird nightclub. In the middle of this lick, you're going to have the alpha male. They're then going to be surrounded by males that are up the hierarchy, but not quite at alpha stage. And then as you go towards the edge or the fringes, you're going to have the subordinates and the juveniles. And we refer to these as satellite males, as they're just going around the outside. So essentially you have this ring of birds called a lek. You've got the lower ranking juvenile subordinates around the side. And as you move into the middle, you move up and up and up more through the dominance hierarchy that's taking place. But again, this is where usually some form of mating call or singing takes place, and females will be around the outside having a look, and female choice will take place. And that's it. That's all for key area 4. It's relatively straightforward. As I said though, there are just a bunch of different words that you need to be using in the right way and know what they mean. But on the whole, you'll be looking at information and trying to work out, is this a case selection? Is this showing our strategies? What are the honest signals being displayed here? What form of sexual selection is taking place? Is this sexual dimorphism? All these words, relatively straightforward. So make sure you go through and have a little look at all of these. So thanks so much for listening. I know we are getting towards the exam now. There is only one key area left, which will get up very soon. So do not worry, it will be there for you. Do not panic. And hopefully you're finding the rest of these videos useful and your revision is going well if you are listening to these live. So best luck with your revision, and I'll see you soon for the final key area. Thanks so much for listening,